Now that Eric Adams is no longer mayor of New York City, are his true colors showing? Last week in New York, he was recorded cursing at a woman who confronted him as he was deplaning from a flight. He reminded the woman he was no longer the mayor and told her, quote, "You're going to see the Brooklyn in me," unquote. He may not be the mayor any longer, but before he left office, Adams made sure to appoint landlord friendly members to New York City's Rent Guidelines Board. That board now has a majority of members who oppose a rent freeze for tenants in the city, which many believe is directly sabotaging current Mayor Zohran Mamdani's campaign promise to provide some type of relief for renters in the city. Here to talk with me about what's going on is Sumathy Kumar of Housing Justice for All, a statewide coalition that represents tenants and homeless New Yorkers united in the fight for housing as a human right. Thank you so much for being on Hard Knock Radio today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious to see for everyone to see. Eric Adams is a thug. Okay, no problem. Moving right along. The concern, however, is this move that he made just before he dipped out of office, appointing what are said to be landlord friendly appointees to New York City's Rent Guidelines Board. Can you tell us what is the Rent Guidelines Board, real quick? And then I want to go into housing justice for all.
Yeah, so the Rent Guidelines Board is a mayor appointed board that determines how much rent stabilized rents should go up or down every year. So it looks at data, it hears from landlords, it hears from tenants, and then every year around June, it makes a final decision of what rent adjustments rent stabilized tenants. There's around 2.4 million rent stabilized tenants in New York City. It determines how much their rent should change from year to year.
From year to year, there are no holdings. I guess that's the whole part of the whole point of the rent freeze is to, I mean, every year, every year.
Every year, some people can sign for 2 year leases, some people can sign for 1 year, but every year, this board decides. In the past, we've seen rent freezes during, when mayors have been more friendly to tenants. Under Eric Adams, he raised the rent every year that he was in office. And he did try to sabotage a rent freeze in his final days in office, but it doesn't look like that's going to work. And I do think we're going to win a rent freeze this year for rent stabilized tenants.
Okay, so housing justice for all, you all deal with coalition based organizing. You believe that housing is a human right. Not only do you work with tenants, you work with unhoused, homeless folks.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, tell us about the Freeze the Rent campaign and your grassroots mobilizations to that end.
So every year, like I said, the Rent Guidelines Board votes. We were seeing every year rent increases, all while the housing crisis was spiraling out of control. And tenants knew we needed a rent freeze. So
Mhm.
last year, during the mayoral election in New York City, we organized 20,000 rent stabilized tenants to come together and demand that the next mayor, whoever they were, freeze the rent. And we were able to pressure a lot of candidates to get on board with a rent freeze. Zohran Mamdani ran on a 4-year rent freeze. The tenant block, which is Housing Justice for All's sister organization, endorsed Zohran Mamdani for mayor. He won, and we turned out all of those people all of those renters who had been fighting for a rent freeze to vote for a rent freeze mayor. And it was a show of collective force. Tenants are 70% of New York City. We are really the backbone of New York. And we came together last year to say the next mayor has this power. He can freeze the rent, and he absolutely needs to for the next 4 years.
Yeah. So I was going to say, so his Mamdani's campaign promise is there will be no rent increases for a period of 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, rent stabilization, is that the same thing as rent control?
So it is. There's just two technical legal terms in New York for these two things, but fundamentally, yes. What we're talking about is a system that regulates rents. That says your landlord shouldn't be able to charge you some huge percentage, give you some random rent hike for no reason. You should have stability and a sense of, your rent goes up, might go up, but you should know why and how. And that's where the rent guidelines board comes in. The other amazing thing about rent stabilization is that it says that you have the right to renew your lease. So you have that stability. You don't have to wonder every year when your lease is up, oh, is my landlord going to change his mind? Is he going to just retaliate against me for speaking up? Is he going to just try to force me out? You have the right to renew your lease, and you have the right to rent increases that are adjusted by this rent guidelines board. And so we want them to be lower. They should generally be low in rent increases. But you also have the ability to organize with all the other rent stabilized tenants in the city to make sure that those rent increases are low, or even that we have a rent freeze.
Hmm. Now, the name of the entity is the Rent Guidelines Board. Is
Mm-hmm.
this an advisory board? What type of political power do they actually have?
So their power is that they vote every year to they decide how much rent stabilized rents go up. So they actually have an enormous amount of power for
Oh,
the.
so no, what I'm saying is, so if they say, yeah, raise the rents, that means the rents go up, or
Yeah.
someone in the city or in the Department of Housing says, well, they recommend it go up. So, I mean,
No, it's a real vote. What they say happens.
mm,
They are entirely appointed by the mayor,
mhm.
so it's really, you know, they're voting on that, but they're in that position because the mayor put them there. So mayors who want rent freezes or mayors who want low rent increases will appoint tenant friendly folks. And landlord friendly mayors have appointed people who have raised the rent a huge amount.
Just out of curiosity, do we know how much, if any, property Eric Adams owns in New York City? Is he also a landlord?
The question of how much property Eric Adams owns is not clear.
Mm,
He has different. He at least owns some houses. At least
mm,
um, we while he was mayor, we were like, do you live in New Jersey? Do you live in New York City? It was unclear.
mm,
But he's the guy who said, as mayor, I am real estate. So he
mm.
was very clear about what side he was on, and it was not the side of 70% of New York City, which is tenants.
Right. So 70% of New Yorkers are tenants. You
Mm-hmm.
say you were able to mobilize at minimum 20,000 folks
Mm-hmm.
around the issue of a rent freeze.
Yes. So over the last year, we collected 20,000 signatures from folks who wanted a rent freeze from the next mayor. We then organized those people into a political force that came out to rallies, asked their neighbors to sign on, and then ultimately voted for a rent freeze mayor in June and then again in November.
Mhm. Now, earlier you stated that this move by Adams at the end of his tenure looked like it was intended to sabotage Mamdani's work, his proposal, but you don't think it's going to work. Why is that?
So Eric Adams floated two people to try to last minute appoint people to the board. Two of those people, so first someone said, no, never mind, I don't want to do this. Then he tried to do another person, I think literally on New Year's Eve, his last day, he tried to put forward another person to be on the board, and then that person also declined to participate. And so he was unsuccessful at really stacking the board against a rent freeze. And I think that's because those people knew that tenants were organized and they were ready and they were going to pressure anybody who's on that board to fight for a rent freeze, and they didn't want to deal with that. So his last minute sabotage, it just doesn't appear to have worked. And now we're going to keep organizing and make sure that we get that rent freeze this year.
So these appointments, are there now vacancies on the board?
There are vacancies on the board, and I expect that Mayor Mamdani will be appointing people over the next few months to serve. Yeah.
And you said the vote takes place every June.
Yeah, the final vote takes place every June. There's a whole process. So there's a preliminary vote. There's a report that comes out about housing costs, and then there's hearings across the city on what tenants are facing, what landlords are facing, and then a final vote in June on how much the adjustments are going to be.
Okay. And for the record, how many seats are there on the rent board, the rent guidelines board?
So there's 9 seats. There are 2 landlord reps, 2 tenant reps, and then 5 public members. And so the public members really make up the majority. And usually, you know how the tenant reps are gonna vote, you know how the landlord reps are gonna vote. And the question is really on the public members.
This is Hard Knock Radio on the Pacifica Network. I'm Thandisizwe Chimurenga, sitting in for Davey D. I'm speaking with Sumathy Kumar of Housing Justice for All, a statewide coalition that represents tenants and homeless New Yorkers united in the fight for housing as a human right. 70% of New Yorkers are renters. 20,000 folks at minimum mobilized in support of a rent freeze. I don't remember. Just a few years ago, it was a major storm coming to New York City. They were talking about evacuating people. Either they wanted to evacuate, they should have evacuated. I just remember there were discussions about so many homeless in the subways. And once that storm hit, there was footage of the subways being flooded. And I remember thinking, my God, where did the people go? Did they get them out in time? I want to ask, I almost know the question, but let me ask you, because this is your area. How are the rent hikes affecting various sections of the New York community? The working class, immigrants, the elderly, Black folks. What's the reality currently?
Yeah, we've seen rent hikes all across the city just make life impossible for so many people in New York. Rent has gone up and up and up, and there just hasn't been enough relief. So people are leaving the city because they can't afford to stay here. New York's Black population has decreased by almost 250,000 people over the last 20 years, and it's because of the high cost of living. People are moving everywhere they can, whether it's upstate New York, whether it's to the South. They just can't stay in New York City anymore. And we've seen the homeless population in New York City and in New York State keep rising because there's just nowhere to find a place to live. And rent stabilization is really like the one of the key ways that people are still able to afford to live here. It is really the largest affordability program in New York City. And that's why it's so important that we have rent freezes, because this is one of the like key ways that working class people are staying in our city. And so any rent hike just adds pressure to that and forces people to take on extra jobs, to choose between rent or healthcare or rent or groceries. And all of that rent money, all of those rent hikes are just going to line landlords' pockets. They're not going to fixing buildings. They're just going to enrich the people who own those buildings. And so people really don't see any improvements to their housing, even while they're paying even more in rents. So it's just an untenable situation that we're hoping a new change in administration and a whole lot of tenant power can change.
Just out of curiosity, the struggle to implement a rent freeze the rent, stop the rents. Why not a rent strike?
So that's certainly part of what folks are doing. A rent freeze is something that the government can do. It's actually very simple for the mayor and the mayor's rent guidelines board to freeze the rent this year.
Mm-hmm.
And then to enforce it, we need to work with the city agencies and with tenants on the ground in their buildings, saying, if I'm getting an illegal rent hike, they need to be able to organize and stop it and get in touch with the city and hold the landlord accountable. But at the same time, like, tenants across the city are organizing, are going on rent strike for repairs, for all the things that are wrong with their building, and they're winning in a lot of cases. So I don't think it's an either or. The rent freeze is something that any rent stabilized tenant will benefit from once the government does its job. And a rent strike is a tool that any tenant can use to win even more, to win repairs or anything that they want when they're working together with their neighbors.
But I'm wondering, does Housing Justice for All advocate rent strikes?
In situations where people aren't getting the things that they're paying for, where, people are living in substandard conditions, there's no heat, there's no gas, things like that, a rent strike is definitely a tool that tenants can use when they come together, because it's all about tenant power. We have power because our rent money is what is fueling the profits of these landlords, just like our votes are fueling the rise of certain politicians. And so we can use both our rent money and our votes to change the course of the housing crisis and put things back in tenants' favor.
Right. So you're framing housing as a human right. Can you
Mm-hmm.
walk me through how you do that in your day-to-day work? Housing Justice for All's day-to-day work. What does it mean to say that housing is a human right?
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to make it a reality.
Hmm.
So we are fighting at the state level for different pieces of legislation that put together would give people that right to housing, rental assistance to cover the gap where people can't afford the rent, rent stabilization, rent control, so that the rent doesn't go up all astronomically for no reason, and people have the right to stay in their homes and the right to organize. And then a lot of money for social housing and housing that is deeply and permanently affordable, that residents can control. And so we are fighting for all of those things, and together they can create a system where no one is homeless, where everyone has control over where they live in some form or another, and where the rent is just not too high, where it's actually affordable and you can live there and raise a family or set down roots and have a real community. And so we're fighting at the legislative level for all of those things. We're fighting at the ballot box by electing pro-tenant legislators. And then we're fighting in our buildings to hold our landlords accountable to that vision and build tenant power in our homes.
I've been speaking with Sumathy Kumar of Housing Justice for All, statewide coalition in New York City that represents both tenants and homeless New Yorkers. They are united in the fight for housing as a human right. Sumathy, for Hard Knock listeners who want more information on your organization and the work you're doing, how can they get that?
You can go to housingjusticeforall.org and find out how to plug in, what our platform is, and what they can do to get involved over there.
Okay, thank you so much for being on Hard Knock Radio today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
40 degrees, the rain falls hard. An old man sleeps, no roof, no guard. Under the freeway, lost in cold. Somebody's father left out alone. What mother could picture this sight? Her child forgotten, lost to the night. $1 million homes lie in the way, but for him there's no shelter, no place to stay. What happens to us when we fall from grace? Fall from grace. When the world turns its back and we lose our place. Lose our place. Why do the evil people never ever die? While the good ones suffer and ask the sky, is there no justice for the ones who cry? Will we ever rise? Will we ever thrive? As this old man shivers in the dead of night, rich people passing their lives full of light, they turn a blind eye, too busy to care, while he's left to freeze in the cold, cold air. Why do the evil people never ever die? While the good ones suffer and ask the sky, is there no justice for the ones who cry? Will we ever rise? Will we ever thrive?
Killing for clickbait. The shocking killing of 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good by a contemptuous ICE agent is a sad but true testament of our times. The nation is riven by conflict on a host of issues, principally the manner of how immigration is actually practiced in the real world, rather than driven by online rhetorics. Good, a mother of 3 children, had just driven her 6-year-old son to school when she returned to volunteer for her neighbors in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who were demonized for their Somalian and or Latino backgrounds. Her actions, driven by caring and community, have too been demonized as leftist, as radical, or as in the stinging words of the head of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, a domestic terrorist. Family related to Mrs. Good have described her as a Christian, and perhaps her faith moved her to care for her immigrant neighbors. The federal government, now openly in the grips of rightist ideology, sees U.S. citizens as enemies who may be executed if they don't obey their orders. Their position is actually crystal clear: obey or die, period. Sound familiar? It should, for this was the message radiating from the Third Reich. This is the message of kings to their subjects. This is the message of power to the powerless. But people, thinking people, feeling people, have more power than they realize, for they have the power to say no. That power mattered to Renee Nicole Good. It should still matter to you. With love, not fear, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Ha! Hey, hard knock radio. East, west, north, south, conectados. Every set, every hood, barrio to barrio. Y'all stand up, stay righteous. Speaking to the thugs, one love. We know where y'all at. Ha! Brown Buffalo. It's a hard knock life, gotta pay your bills. They want a song about bling, but it ain't real. We speak to the kids and the OGs. Organized, mobilized, be the change you wanna see. 415s bumping hard knock radio. Brown Buffalo, all up in your stereo. And to the youth, live life like it's golden. Go dumb, go hard, but don't forget where you going. We from the hood, so it's all to the good. Let us know this what you're feeling is right. Let's get this understood. It's only one reason why we here today. We tryna make real music so the people can relate.
Learning from these hard knocks, slipping in these hard knocks, listening to hard knocks, questioning the podcast. Learning through these hard knocks, living for this hip hop, listening to hard knocks, ripping to the hard side. Learning from the hard knocks, living in these hard knocks, listening to hard knocks, questioning the podcast. Learning through these hard knocks, living for this hip hop, listening to hard knocks, ripping to the hard side.